At Christmas dinner, my sister toasted to her billionaire dreams and mocked me for settling for a mechanic. I didn't argue. But when her husband's empire collapsed and he showed up begging at our garage, that was the night the family's pride turned to silence, and my revenge finally began. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Portland always looked like a postcard in December, snow softening the rooftops, streetlights glowing gold, and the air smelling faintly of pine and cinnamon. My parents' house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, every inch of it wrapped in twinkle lights. Through the windows, I could already see the silhouettes of guests holding champagne glasses, the kind of crowd that had known my family's holiday routine for years. My husband, Ethan, parked our old Ford pickup beside a line of glossy SUVs. The sound of their engines dying out felt like a warning. I looked down at the tin of gingerbread cookies I'd baked that morning. "Ready?" he asked, slipping on his coat. His hands were rough and warm, smelling faintly of oil and cedar soap. I smiled, as I'll ever be. When we stepped inside, warmth and noise hit us at once, laughter, silverware, clinking, the smell of rosemary turkey. My father's deep voice carried from the dining room, telling one of his real estate stories. Conversation paused for a heartbeat when people noticed us. Then, as if nothing had happened, it resumed with polite enthusiasm. My sister Vanessa appeared almost instantly, her heels clicking across the hardwood, a perfect vision in red satin. She hugged me the way someone hugs a stranger, lightly perfunctory, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "You made it," she said. "Traffic okay?" "We're fine," I replied. Ethan handed over a modest bottle of Merlot. "For dinner," he offered. My mother took it, her smile tight. How thoughtful, she said, already placing it on the sideboard, next to a cluster of imported wines, with gold foil labels. Vanessa linked arms with her husband Adam, who stood near the fireplace holding court. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than our truck. His voice carried over the hum of conversation. "And we're finalizing the $12 million partnership next week," he was saying, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A major fund in Palo Alto. It's going to redefine clean tech investments." Vanessa beamed and lifted her glass. "To my genius husband," she announced. Everyone applauded. My parents looked at each other, pride glowing on their faces. Adam laughed, modestly glancing around the room, as if expecting cameras. "We're changing the game," he added. "You have to think big, right?" Vanessa turned toward me, still smiling, eyes glittering with the kind of curiosity that always came before a jab. "And you, Clara?" "Still keeping things simple?" she asked. "Still running that little garage of yours?" "Still running it," I said evenly. "We like it that way." "How admirable," she said, the words dripping sweet as syrup. "Not everyone can commit to the minimalist lifestyle." Laughter followed, light, polite, the kind that stings more because it hides behind good manners. One of my father's friends chuckled. "There's something to be said for humility these days," he added. My father cleared his throat. "So, Clara, how's the teaching going?" he asked quickly, steering the conversation elsewhere. My mother touched Vanessa's elbow in warning, but the damage was done. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, measuring, comparing, filing me neatly into the same box they'd kept me in since childhood. The quiet one, the plain one, the one who'd married beneath her. Ethan slipped his hand into mine under the table. His thumb brushed my knuckles, steady grounding. "Teaching's good," I said finally. "And the garage keeps us busy." Adam raised his glass toward me. "Hey, blue-collar America keeps the wheels turning, right?" More laughter. Vanessa giggled and kissed his cheek. I watched her, wondering if she even realized how practiced her cruelty had become, or if it was just muscle memory now. Dinner resumed. The clatter of silverware filled the air again. The table gleamed with crystal and silver candles reflecting in their polished surfaces. My mother passed around dishes, careful to keep conversation light. Across from me, Vanessa leaned toward a neighbor and whispered something that made them both smile. My father talked loudly about property values. I sat back, listening. The warmth from the fire touched my face, but inside, I felt cold. I watched Ethan cut his turkey and ask my mother if she needed help in the kitchen. He belonged anywhere, I thought. He didn't need fancy degrees or tailored suits to command respect. When dessert arrived, pumpkin pie with whipped cream, imported chocolate truffles, Vanessa lifted her phone to take pictures. "Perfect lighting," she murmured. She posted something immediately, showing the table, laden with food, captioned with a hashtag about family and blessings. The irony made my stomach twist. She caught me watching. "Smile, Clara," she said, pointing the camera at me. "Come on, let's show everyone you made it to the big family dinner." I smiled, not the polite kind, the kind that hides fire behind still water. She didn't notice. Ethan reached for my hand again under the table. "Almost done," he whispered. I nodded. Through the window behind Vanessa, snow kept falling. Quiet, steady, indifferent to everything happening inside that house. I looked around the table, my parents beaming at Vanessa, guests laughing at Adam's jokes, the chandelier glittering above like a crown for the wrong queen. I'd spent years trying to fit into this picture. Tonight, I realized I never wanted to again. I lifted my glass when Vanessa proposed another toast, her words ringing with self-satisfaction. "To success," she said. I let my voice join hers softly. "To the kind that lasts." Nobody noticed the difference, but Ethan did. His fingers tightened around mine. The candles flickered, and the laughter rolled on. Inside that perfect holiday picture, I sat quietly smiling, waiting for the night when the picture would finally crack. I grew up in a small town an hour outside Portland. The kind of place where everyone knew which driveway belonged to which family and every girl in my school joined cheer or choir. I didn't. I preferred to sit in the garage beside my dad's old Ford, pulling apart a busted radio or an engine that hadn't run since before I was born. I liked the smell of grease and the click of tools fitting into place. My father didn't. "Girls don't crawl under cars, Clara," he'd say, standing at the doorway with his arms crossed. "It's not proper." My mother would glance up from her gardening gloves and sigh. "He's right, sweetheart. Why not take an art class?" "Do something clean." I didn't answer, just tightened the bolt on the carburetor until the wrench squealed. Vanessa, 2 years older, and already a spectacle, was inside practicing her speech for the state debate finals. She'd won every local competition that year, her name printed in the paper with rising star next to it. My parents framed that article, hung it right over the piano. At dinner, they talked about her gestures, her poise, her gift. My father liked to say that one was born for the spotlight. He'd turn to me, then add kindly, "And you're just different. It was meant to be gentle." It never felt that way. When Vanessa got her driver's license, she didn't touch a car manual. I was the one who changed her brake pads. "You're like a little mechanic," she teased once. Not meanly, not kindly either. "If I ever need someone to fix my future husband's car, I'll call you." I smiled like it didn't sting. That was the thing about being the quiet one. You learned to smile a lot. Senior year, I applied to Oregon Tech to study mechanical engineering. When the acceptance letter came, my father looked at it like it was a joke. "You want to spend your life elbow deep in oil?" he asked. "Conferences, meetings, suits. That's where success is, not in garages." My mother put a hand on his arm but said nothing to me. Later, when I told her I'd already enrolled, she shook her head. "Men don't want a woman who smells like metal, so, Clara, you're too smart to make yourself smaller that way." I didn't have the words to explain that working with machines made me feel larger than anything else ever had. College was hard and lonely. I was one of 4 women in the program, always proving I deserved the seat. I spent nights in the lab soldering circuit boards, skipping parties I was never invited to. When I graduated, I got a job at a small electric vehicle company in Seattle. Entry level, but honest. My apartment was barely bigger than a storage unit, but I could pay rent and keep my hands busy. That was enough for me. Vanessa moved faster. She took a marketing course, started a social media account about personal finance, then another about female ambition. Within a year, she was traveling to Miami, New York, Los Angeles, taking selfies at rooftop brunches with captions about empowerment. My mother called me once to gush. "She's doing so well. Can you believe she has 70,000 followers?" People really listened to her. I congratulated her even though I'd seen the posts, polished smiles, expensive handbags, and quotes about chasing dreams. I wondered if any of her followers knew that most of her advice came from my father's old business lectures. Every time I called home, my father asked the same question. "So when are you going to move on from that job? You're wasting your potential, sweetheart. You could work in finance. Maybe Vanessa can help you network." I said I was fine. He sighed like that was the problem. One Christmas I drove home alone. Vanessa couldn't come. She was in Cabo with an investor group. I found my parents in the living room, showing neighbors a glossy magazine spread. Vanessa was on the cover in a white blazer, arms folded, headline, bold, "The Future of Female Wealth." They hadn't noticed me standing there yet. On the coffee table sat another magazine folded open to a small column about a regional EV project I'd helped design. My name was in the credits. My father used it as a coaster for his drink. When they finally saw me, my mother smiled too brightly. "Look at your sister." "Isn't she something?" she said, handing me the magazine. I glanced at the page. Vanessa's photo perfectly lit her eyes, full of certainty. I put it down beside my project article and said, "Yes, she's something. My father asked if work was steady. I said it was." He nodded, not listening. Later that night, I sat in my old room, posters of constellations still on the wall. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the furnace. Outside, snow fell on the streetlight the same way it did every winter, steady and unbothered. I looked at my hands, the faint grease under my nails that never quite washed off, and thought how those hands built things, fixed things, made them work again. My sister's hands held microphones and wine glasses. My mother's held memories of what she wished we'd both been. No one ever asked if I was happy. They only asked if I was enough. I wasn't angry, just aware. That night, something small inside me shifted a click, like metal locking into place. It didn't sound like resentment. It sounded like resolve. It was late February 2010. The kind of Portland rain that felt endless, thin, cold, and determined, came down in sheets as I sat inside my old Honda Civic, staring at a dashboard light blinking red. The car sputtered, coughed, and died right there in the middle of an empty side street near the industrial district. My wipers dragged slow streaks across the glass. I was exhausted after a 10-hour shift at the EV plant and just wanted to go home. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. I cursed under my breath, pulled on my coat, and stepped out into the rain. The nearest building was a squat brick garage with a faded sign that read Helios Repair. It looked half-shuttered. One fluorescent tube flickering weakly through the windows, but the sound of metal clinking came from inside. I pushed the door open, letting the smell of oil and steel hit me. A man looked up from under the hood of a truck, wiping his hands on a rag. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was even calm, like the rain didn't exist. "My car's dead," I said, pushing wet hair from my face. "Completely." Just a click when I turned the key. He nodded once, grabbed a flashlight, and followed me out. He wore a faded gray shirt with his name stitched over the pocket. "Ethan." He popped my hood and leaned in. For a long minute, there was only the sound of rain hitting metal. Then he asked, "You work with EVs?" I blinked. "Yeah, how'd you know?" He smiled slightly. "You've got lithium battery modules in a 2009 Civic conversion. Not many people do that unless they know what they're doing." I felt my shoulders relax. "I helped retrofit it last year. Guess it didn't stick." He chuckled, soft and genuine. "Batteries don't like cold. I can jump it for now, but you might want to tweak your insulation circuit. Mind if I show you?" He moved with precision. No wasted motion, no arrogance. He spoke about current flow and regenerative charge as naturally as other men talked about football. Within minutes, the engine hummed weakly back to life. "How much do I owe you?" I asked, pulling out my wallet. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just stop by sometime. I'd like to hear how you handled the lithium pack integration. Most people don't get it right." Something in his tone wasn't flirtation. It was respect. I nodded, half smiling. "Maybe I will." I did. A week later, I stopped by the shop after work. The rain had turned to mist, the kind that made the air smell like wet concrete. Ethan was working on an old Chevy pickup. He looked up, surprised but pleased. "Hey, engineer," he said, handing me a pair of gloves. "Grab a wrench. I'm fighting a stubborn alternator." That became our routine. I'd drop in after work sometimes with takeout, sometimes just curiosity. We'd talk about engines and renewable systems, sketching out ridiculous designs on napkins. He had the mind of a craftsman. Practical, inventive, patient. He wasn't like anyone I'd known at the EV company. There, everyone was chasing titles, promotions, appearances. Ethan chased solutions. One evening, as the sun dipped low through the garage windows, he asked, "Why'd you leave your name off the last research paper?" I froze. He must have looked me up, because my boss said investors would take it more seriously if it came from someone else. He frowned. "That's crap." I shrugged. "That's corporate life." He wiped his hands and looked straight at me. "Then maybe you need to build something that doesn't belong to them." I didn't answer, but the idea stuck. Weeks turned into months. Sometimes we talked about nothing. music, weather, coffee brands. Other times we spent hours debating the efficiency of brushless motors versus regenerative braking systems. There was no pretension, no performance, just quiet understanding. One night we sat off the concrete floor eating Chinese takeout tools scattered around us. You ever think he said between bites that fixing things could change more than one life at a time? I laughed. You mean like a metaphor? He shook his head. No, like literally. Cleaner engines better design real change. I don't just want to make a living, Clara. I want to make something that matters. Something in his voice. The steady conviction, the way he said my name like it wasn't small, made my chest tighten. By that summer, we were inseparable. I still rented my little apartment downtown, but I spent most evenings at Helios. We built a prototype together, a small hybrid generator that barely worked but made us feel invincible. When autumn came, he took me to the coast in his beat-up Ford. The ocean wind whipped through the open windows, salt and freedom mixing in the air. We stopped near a cliff overlooking gray water. You ever think you're in the right place? Finally, he asked. I looked at him. His hair tousled, hands calloused from work, eyes steady. Yeah, I said. Right now. Months passed before he asked me to marry him. It wasn't grand or planned. We were outside the shop one evening, sitting on the hood of his truck, watching the sun slip behind the trees. He pulled a small silver ring from his pocket, simple and unpolished like everything else about him. I can't promise luxury, he said. But I can promise peace. I laughed through a rush of tears. You're not selling yourself very hard. I don't have to, he said. You already know what matters. I said yes before he finished breathing the question. We married in the spring of 2017. 30 people came, friends from work, a few of Ethan's old customers, my mother, who stayed only an hour. My father had business commitments. Vanessa sent flowers with a note that read, "So happy for you. Keep it simple." We hung strings of lights across the garage, laid mismatched chairs under them, and served food we'd cooked ourselves. One of Ethan's friends played guitar. Someone brought homemade cider. When the sun went down, I looked around. The soft glow of lights against the steel walls, the laughter of real friends, Ethan's hand on mine, and felt something I'd never felt at my parents' table belonging. I didn't have a diamond ring or a honeymoon in Paris, but I had grease on my hands and peace in my heart. For the first time in my life, I wasn't performing. I'd chosen something real over something shiny. And for me, that was the purest kind of victory. The afternoon sun dipped low over the pine trees, spreading warm light across the backyard of Ethan's garage. Strings of cheap bulbs hung between the oak branches, glowing faintly in the late spring breeze. The smell of barbecue drifted through the air, mixed with the scent of engine oil that always lingered here. It wasn't a fancy venue, just gravel underfoot, folding tables covered in linen, and mason jars filled with wildflowers. But it felt perfect. It felt like us. We had said our vows beneath an arch Ethan built from reclaimed wood, and when he slipped the simple silver ring onto my finger, I thought this is what peace feels like. No spotlights, no expectations, no performance, just truth. The guests' clapped music started. Soft guitar and an old country song. And people began to dance. I stood there barefoot on the cool grass, watching the string lights flicker against the twilight. Ethan laughed with his friends near the grill. My mother sat quietly near the back, hands folded in her lap, smiling faintly but not meeting my eyes. I didn't blame her. I knew she was thinking about what the neighbors would say, about how small the ceremony was, how different from Vanessa's imagined grandeur. Then the sound of tires on gravel cut through the music. Heads turned. A sleek white Tesla Model S rolled up headlights flaring, the kind of entrance meant to be noticed. Vanessa stepped out first, draped in a red silk dress that shimmered even in the fading light. Adam followed in a tailored navy suit, the kind that screamed expensive. Conversations faltered. Someone turned down the music. Well, Vanessa said, brightly, spreading her arms as if she were walking onto a red carpet. Hope we're not too late. She air-kissed the air near my cheek, not quite touching. You know traffic coming from downtown? It's a nightmare. Glad you made it, I said, keeping my voice steady. Ethan came over, shaking Adam's hand. Adam looked around with a tight smile, taking in the scene. The mismatched chairs, the buffet tables lined with homemade dishes, the string lights swaying above the garage doors. Rustic, he said finally. Nice vibe. Very grassroots. Vanessa looped her arm through his. It's adorable, she added loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. A wedding that's all about love, not money. So rare these days. The words hung in the air just this side of kind. A few guests exchanged glances. Someone cleared their throat. We moved on. Dinner was served. Pulled pork corn salad, apple pie. The music picked up again, but Vanessa's laughter carried louder than the guitar. Every compliment she gave came with an edge. Oh, this is homemade. That's so cute. Adam and I used to love doing casual things like this, back when we were still saving for the Tesla. Adam chuckled, leaning back in his chair. You know, I respect people who aren't obsessed with money, he said, raising his glass. Especially the ones who don't have any to obsess over. A few polite laughs rippled across the table. My mother looked down at her plate. Ethan's hand found mine under the table, fingers warm and steady. Don't, he whispered. They don't understand us. I took a slow breath. I know I said softly, but one day they will. Vanessa didn't notice. She was already showing a photo of their new condo to a couple sitting nearby. Downtown skyline view, she said. And Adam's office is right in the Pearl District. You should come visit, just maybe not during business hours. Someone tried to steer the conversation to the food. This pie's incredible, Clara, an old co-worker of mine, said. You made it? I did, I replied, smiling gratefully. It's Ethan's favorite. Vanessa raised her glass again, her lipstick leaving a perfect print on the rim. A toast, she declared, to the newlyweds. May your love be as lasting as... She glanced around the garage, her smile sharpening. These lights, simple but bright. Laughter followed. Adam added, and may your bank account never dim. That one landed harder. I heard someone mutter, too far, but they still smiled. People always smiled around money. My chest burned. I caught my mother's eyes. She looked away, embarrassed. My father hadn't come. He'd claimed a conference. Maybe he just didn't want to see me marry a mechanic. When the music started again, Ethan leaned close, voice low. You want to leave early? I shook my head. No. This is our day. They don't get to ruin it. Later, when the guests had gone and the last plates were cleared, we stood under the empty string lights. The air smelled like rain again, the night cool and quiet. I picked up a half-empty champagne flute from one of the tables, its bubbles flat. Ethan wrapped his arms around me from behind. Still sure about this whole forever thing, he teased. I smiled into the darkness. More sure than ever. He kissed the top of my head. The hum of the city was faint in the distance, and for a moment it felt like the world had gone still. As we gathered the glasses, I looked at the light bulbs swaying above, the same ones I'd helped string that morning. They flickered softly one by one. Around us, the laughter from earlier seemed to echo faintly, but now it didn't sting. It sounded like something small fading into memory. I stacked the last plate, turned to Ethan, and said quietly, Let them laugh. It won't last. He smiled. No, it won't. When he walked inside to lock up, I stood alone for a moment looking at the yard, our yard, lit by those imperfect bulbs. The air smelled of rain and smoke, of endings and beginnings. I promised myself then, right there under the lights, that this would be the last time anyone made me feel small. They could laugh, they could whisper, they could walk in with their Teslas, and their champagne, and their smug toasts. But someday they'd see what they missed, and when that day came, I wouldn't need to say a word. By early 2017, the air in Portland smelled like new beginnings and engine oil. I quit my job at the electric vehicle plant with 2 months of savings, and a folder full of unfinished designs. Ethan didn't hesitate when I told him my plan. Then let's build something real, he said. We registered the name Helios Drive Systems a week later. The paperwork sat pinned to the garage wall next to a hand-drawn logo, a gear wrapped in a sunburst. It wasn't much, but it felt alive. Our garage became half workshop, half laboratory. Old shelves were stacked with bolts wires, and mismatched parts scavenged from junkyards. We bought a second-hand welding table off Craigslist, and borrowed a diagnostic scanner from one of Ethan's customers. Most nights, sparks filled the air. Metal hissed under the torch, and the smell of solder hung so thick it clung to our clothes. There were burns on my sleeves, oil under my nails, and bruises on my knuckles from prying stubborn bolts. We didn't care. We were chasing something that didn't exist yet, a hybrid retrofit system cheap enough and strong enough to keep old trucks running without killing the planet. Our first few attempts were disasters. One prototype caught fire. Another blew a fuse so loud it sounded like a gunshot. Ethan would kill the power wipe the sweat from his forehead and laugh. At least it didn't explode this time, he'd say, and I'd roll my eyes, jotting down notes on the clipboard. He believed in progress, like it was a religion. One day he told me tightening a bolt on the test rig, we're going to build something the world actually needs, not some corporate toy. Something that works. I believed him. Money ran out quickly. We canceled every unnecessary bill. No streaming, no dining out, no new clothes. Dinner was instant noodles or grilled cheese. I sold my old laptop to afford more battery cells. Ethan sold his vintage tool set. When I mentioned taking freelance work to help cover expenses, he said, "No, you keep your head in this. We'll make it work." Sometimes I didn't believe him, but then he'd look at me, calm, unshaken, and it was enough. By 2019, the garage looked like a Frankenstein lab wires, hanging from the ceiling charts, taped to the walls, components scattered in labeled boxes. We worked through holidays, birthdays, everything. Rain or shine, the lights in Helios stayed on. I reached out to my old professor at Oregon Tech, Dr. Simmons, sending him photos of our circuit layout and test data. He replied the next day. "You're onto something," he wrote. "Your torque conversion numbers are promising, but watch your voltage differential." That email became our fuel. I printed it and taped it above the workbench. By 2:20, we had our first working prototype. It wasn't pretty. Scratched metal casing, uneven welds. But when the engine turned over, the hybrid system actually kicked in. I watched the numbers on the laptop climb, my heart pounding as the data stabilized. Efficiency up by 18%. Emissions down 22%. Ethan threw his arms around me and laughed, breathless. "Told you," he said. "The world just doesn't know it yet." We kept refining. More failures, more long nights. But the numbers kept improving. By the time 2022 rolled around, we were ready to test it outside our bubble. Through a mutual friend, we were introduced to a manager at Cascade Freight, a regional logistics company with a fleet of aging diesel trucks bleeding money on fuel. He came by the shop one chilly February morning, skeptical but curious. "You're telling me this setup can cut fuel costs by 20%? He asked, rubbing his hands together. Ethan grinned. "Give us one truck in 2 weeks. If you don't see a difference, you don't pay." The man hesitated, then handed over the keys to a worn-out Ford F-250 that looked older than I was. We worked around the clock. 2 weeks later, when the truck rolled out of the garage, it hummed smoother than it ever had. A month later, the results came in. Fuel consumption down 23%. Maintenance costs projected to drop by a third. Cascade Freight's manager showed up in person, grinning like he'd won the lottery. "You two might have just built the future," he said, shaking Ethan's hand. Word spread quietly through the logistics world. Within months, other companies were asking for demonstrations. Marcus, a corporate attorney recommended by Dr. Simmons, helped us draft contracts, NDAs, and patent filings. "You're not mechanics anymore," he told us. "You're innovators. Protect what's yours." He helped us file for full IP protection, every circuit, every design. The process took months, endless paperwork, and more legal fees than we could afford. But by 2023, Helios Drive Systems was official patents and all. When the Cascade Freight deal was finalized in June that year, the contract amount made me dizzy. $20 million for exclusive licensing and ongoing support. We didn't celebrate with champagne. Ethan made coffee. We sat on the shop floor surrounded by blueprints, the hum of the testing rig still in the background. He leaned his head back against the wall, smiling faintly. "You realize what this means?" I nodded. "We did it." He laughed quietly. "No, it means they'll come for us now." I didn't understand what he meant until much later. That night, after he went to bed, I stood alone in the garage. The new sign. Helios Drive Systems, hung above the door, freshly polished letters catching the dim light. I traced them with my fingertips, the metal cool and solid. We'd built something that worked, something real. We didn't need to brag or prove anything to anyone. Success, I realized, didn't need to shout. It glowed all on its own. By the end of 2023, our garage was humming from dawn till midnight. Ethan and I still wore the same gray coveralls every day. Our names faded on the pockets, grease on our sleeves that never fully washed out. While we were tightening bolts and running simulations, Vanessa was halfway across the world posting videos of herself sipping wine in Santorini. Every week she had a new destination, a new designer bag, a new caption about living intentionally. Adam, of course, was her perfect match in the spotlight. I watched one of his speeches online, some investment summit in San Francisco broadcasted live. He stood on stage beneath a glowing LED backdrop that said, "Next Front Capital." His voice carried that polished confidence only money could buy. "We're not just succeeding," he said, hands spread wide. "We're redefining the future of finance." The crowd cheered. He smiled like he'd already trademarked the word future. My parents were obsessed. My father bragged to anyone who'd listen. My son-in-law, the genius investor, he told the neighbors. They just bought another property in Scottsdale. Can you believe it? My mother forwarded Vanessa's interviews to me with little heart emojis. "Isn't she incredible?" she'd write. I always replied politely. "Yes, she is," and left it at that. Helios was growing quietly, steadily. We didn't post about it, didn't show off the contracts stacking up in our inbox. The few people who came to the shop saw two overworked mechanics, not engineers, leading a multi-million-dollar breakthrough. We preferred it that way. Noise attracts vultures. One afternoon I stopped by my parents' house. The smell of roast chicken filled the air, and the TV in the living room played softly. Vanessa's face smiling from the screen. She was being interviewed for a lifestyle segment about women balancing success and family. I stood in the doorway while my parents sat on the couch, plates on their laps, eyes glued to her. "Doesn't she look radiant?" my mother said, smiling without looking away. "Such poise. You should take notes, Clara. Maybe talk to her about branding yourself better. You could make your little business more visible." "It's not little, Mom," I said gently. "We're doing fine." My father chuckled. "Fine isn't enough, sweetheart. Look at your sister. You're both smart girls, but she knows how to play the game." The words hit harder than they meant to. I just smiled. I'll keep that in mind. When Vanessa's segment ended, she waved at the camera from her glass-walled condo overlooking the city. "Success is about mindset," she said. "Anyone can create their own version of luxury." I reached into my bag and handed my mother a jar of honey Ethan had made from the hives he kept behind our house. "Here," I said. "Try this. It's the real stuff, not store-bought." She turned it over in her hands a little confused. "You made this." "Ethan did," I said. "But it's ours." She smiled faintly, but her eyes drifted back to the TV, now showing Vanessa's next segment. "You should be proud of her," she murmured. "I am." I said, though pride wasn't what I felt. It was something sharper, something quieter. That night, back home, I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone. Vanessa had posted a new video, her walking through her penthouse, in a silk robe, laughing a glass of champagne in her hand. The caption read, "Hard work pays off. Never settle for less than the life you deserve." Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments calling her inspirational. Ethan came out from the kitchen wiping his hands on a towel, still watching the show. I locked my phone, just catching up. He sat beside me, resting his arm along the back of the couch. "You okay?" I looked toward the window where the reflection of our small home sat framed in the glass. Our second-hand furniture, the soft light of a single lamp, the faint hum of the garage outside. "I'm fine," I said. "Just thinking." "About what?" I smiled faintly. How every light eventually burns out. He didn't press. He just took my hand and squeezed. Outside, the rain started again, tapping gently against the glass. For a moment, I imagined Vanessa in her penthouse lights, blazing cameras, flashing Adam's laughter echoing off marble walls. I wondered if she ever sat in silence, or if she was too afraid of it. People saw perfection when they looked at her life, flights, champagne applause. But I saw the cracks underneath. I saw the endless need to prove to be seen to stay bright enough so no one noticed the emptiness behind the glow. They were addicted to attention. We were addicted to building. I turned off my phone and leaned against Ethan's shoulder. The hum from the garage was steady comforting. Somewhere behind those walls, our next project waited, our real work. Breathing quietly in the dark. They lived in light that blinded them. We lived in the kind that guided us. They looked like the future, but we were the ones actually building it. The heater in the garage rattled against the cold. It was early December, the kind of Portland morning that felt more like steel than air. Gray, wet, heavy. My breath hung in front of me as I crouched beside the test rig, checking a stubborn torque sensor. The machine hummed quietly, a steady rhythm against the wind outside. I was jotting numbers into my logbook when my phone buzzed on the workbench. Andrea's name lit up the screen. I hadn't heard from her in weeks. She was my cousin, the one who never cared much for family gossip, the only one who'd ever called just to ask how I was. Not what I'd achieved. Her voice came through low and urgent. "Clara, are you alone?" I glanced at the open garage door where snow flurries blurred the outline of the street. Yeah. Why, I heard something she said. Something bad about Adam. My stomach tightened. What about him? He's in trouble. Big trouble. People in finance circles are whispering that his fund's collapsing. He's been hemorrhaging money for months. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling on her end. They're selling off assets under the table. The SEC's already sniffing around. I straightened slowly, the wrench in my hand suddenly heavy. That's unfortunate. But what does that have to do with me? Andrea hesitated, and that silence said more than any answer could. "Clara, he's been using Helios's name in some of his proposals, probably to make his investors think he's got connections in renewable tech. If this blows up, and it will, he might drag you into it." My pulse thudded in my ears. "Are you sure I got this from someone who was at a dinner with him last week?" she said. "And there's more. Vanessa told your mom that you could help them get out of this mess. They think you'll bail them out." I leaned back against the cold metal counter, letting the words sink in. Outside, the rain turned heavier, hammering against the tin roof. I didn't answer right away. I just listened. To the storm, to my own breath, to the sound of everything I'd built being quietly pulled into someone else's desperation. Andrea's voice softened. "I'm sending you something." A notification pinged on my phone a moment later, a short audio clip. "Vanessa left her mic on during a call with your mom," Andrea said. "You should hear it yourself." The recording clicked to life. My sister's voice smooth and confident as ever. "Mom, she's got that clean energy company, right? Helios, something. It's worth a fortune. She can help us if she wants to. She owes the family that much." My mother's voice followed, strained and low. "I don't know, Vanessa. You two haven't spoken much." "She will," Vanessa said. "She always folds when we push." I stopped the recording. My thumb hovered over the screen as the words echoed inside my chest. "She always folds." I remembered every dinner, every snide remark, every time they'd laughed while I stayed quiet. Maybe I had folded back then, but not this time. "Thanks for telling me," I said finally. Andrea exhaled. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing," I said. "Not yet." When I hung up, the garage felt colder. The test engine sputtered once, then fell silent. I could see my reflection faintly in the steel casing, eyes sharp, jaw set, the kind of look that came after too many years of being underestimated. A few minutes later, Ethan walked in, his jacket dusted with snow. "Hey," he said, rubbing his hands together. "The forecast says it's going to freeze tonight. You want me to grab more firewood?" "Sure," I said absently. He looked at me, studying my face. "What happened?" I turned the phone screen toward him. Andrea called. "Adam's in deep. He's been using our company's name to cover his losses." Ethan's expression didn't change much, just a slow blink, a sigh. "Figures. And now," I added, "they think we're going to save them." He leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. "You're not actually considering it, right?" "Of course not," I said. "I'm just making sure they can't touch us." He nodded, calm as always. "Good, because if they come for what we built, they'll find out just how wrong they were about us." We didn't talk after that. He went to chop wood. I sat by the window, listening to the wind scrape across the eaves. The snow thickened into a white curtain, soft and relentless. I forwarded Andrea's recording and details to Marcus, our lawyer, with a short message, "Check exposure," quietly. A few hours later, Marcus replied, "We're clean. Their use of the name has no legal standing. Stay silent. Let them move first." I read his words twice. Stay silent. It was strange how power could hide inside stillness. For years, silence had been my defense. Now it was my weapon. That night after dinner, Ethan lit a fire in the living room. The house smelled of pine and smoke. We sat side by side on the couch legs tucked under a shared blanket, the fire crackling like it had something to say. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Ethan turned to me. "You're thinking about them." "I'm thinking about what happens when people realize their empire's made of air," I said. He smiled faintly. "You always see things before they fall." "I just pay attention," I said. "They don't." He reached over, brushed a strand of hair from my face, and looked me in the eye. "Whatever comes next, we hold our ground. No one's taking this from us." I nodded, watching the flames twist in the fireplace. Outside, snow began to layer the window ledge pure and quiet, untouched. When I finally spoke again, my voice was steady. "They spent years teaching me how to endure humiliation," I said. "They forgot that endurance can turn into armor." Ethan didn't reply. He didn't have to. We sat in silence as the fire dimmed the storm outside, thickening until the whole world looked white. It was the soundless kind of night that felt like a warning, the calm before something breaks. The snow had settled thick over Portland by the time the week before Christmas arrived. Lights wrapped around every lamppost downtown, the kind of cheerful glow that made the city look softer than it really was. Inside the garage, though, it was all fluorescent light and the steady hum of machinery, our own little universe where holiday noise couldn't reach. I was finishing a report when the email from Marcus came in. Subject line Cascade Freight. Phase 1, payment complete. I clicked it open. His message was short formal. The first transfer had cleared $20 million in total contract value, Phase 1 payment released. At the bottom, he'd written one extra line. "You two did it." I stared at the screen for a long time, the heat of the laptop against my palms. Ethan was across the room tinkering with one of the hybrid modules. "We're official," I said softly. He looked up, grin slow and proud. "Told you." But even as I smiled back, my phone buzzed on the workbench. Andrea's name again. The pit in my stomach returned before I even answered. Her voice was quiet but tense. "It's getting bad, Clara. Adam's been calling in favors all week. Banks won't touch him. He's trying to get bridge loans through private investors, anyone desperate enough to believe him. And Vanessa. She's panicking. There was a fight. Someone overheard them at a restaurant. She was crying. He was yelling. Something about you." I felt the words tighten in my chest. "What about me?" he said. And I'm quoting here. "She owes us. She wouldn't have any of this without me." Outside, wind pushed against the windows, the world turning white and blurred. I could picture it clearly. Vanessa standing in their marble kitchen, tears streaking her makeup. Adam pacing behind her, voice sharp enough to cut glass. He would be shouting, blaming, grasping for control as the walls started closing in. Vanessa would look at herself in the mirror, mascara running, whispering the same old line. "We can fix this, we always do." "But not this time. Let them fight," I said quietly. "They built this mess together." Andrea hesitated. "Your mom called me earlier. She sounded off. I think they're planning something. Just be careful." After we hung up, I sat there for a while listening to the wind press against the garage door. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. "You've got that look again," he said. "They're falling apart," I told him. "Andrea says Adam's trying to drag Helios into his wreckage." He frowned. "Figures. People like him always think they can spin gold out of other people's work." Then my phone rang again. This time Mom. Her voice trembled like she was holding her breath. "Sweetheart, it's been too long. We're having Christmas dinner at the house. Vanessa and Adam will be there. It would mean so much if you came." Now I asked. "After everything," she hesitated. "Vanessa wants to see you. She's going through a hard time. Maybe you two can talk, clear the air." I could hear the unspoken part. They needed something. They always called when they needed something. I looked at Ethan. He was watching me, jaw tight. "She wants us at Christmas dinner," I said after I hung up. He didn't blink. "If you don't go, they'll say you're hiding. If you do, they'll have to face what they made." For a moment, the silence between us was thick as the snow outside. Then I nodded. "We'll go, but not to eat. To end this." That night, the house was warm, the fire snapping softly in the hearth. Ethan and I sat in front of it, mugs of coffee steaming in our hands. He leaned back, eyes on the flames. "You ever think it's strange," he said, "how the people who tear you down always come running when they need saving?" I thought about Vanessa's perfect life. The penthouse, the interviews, the applause, and how easily it all could crumble once the cameras stopped rolling. "Maybe they confuse success with safety," I said. And when the lights go out, they realize how fragile it really was. He nodded slowly. Then I guess this Christmas they get to find out. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind howled like something alive. That was the thing about the holidays. People pretended it was all about gifts and forgiveness, but deep down, it was about truth, who still believed the old lies, and who had finally stopped pretending. I looked out the window at the snow glowing faintly under the porch light. Somewhere across the city, Vanessa was probably staring out her own window, crying into her hands, while Adam raged about losing control. And I couldn't find it in me to feel sorry for either of them. The greatest gift that year wasn't wrapped under a tree. It was the knowledge that the truth once revealed didn't need a bow. It burned brighter than any light they'd ever bought. The Mitchell house glittered like a magazine cover that night. Gold ribbons, candles flickering in glass holders. A 12-foot pine tree, heavy with ornaments. Music floated through the air, something jazzy and expensive. The kind of background sound meant to make everything feel effortless. Through the window, the snow fell slow and deliberate, blanketing the street in white. Inside it was warm and bright and utterly false. When Ethan and I walked in, the room froze for a fraction of a second. Every conversation paused, every glass halfway lifted. Then, as if on cue, the noise started again. Too loud, too cheerful, the kind of sound people make when they're trying to hide discomfort. My mother hurried over, lips tight in what might have been a smile. "You made it," she said, voice too bright. My father gave Ethan a firm handshake, eyes scanning his simple suit. "Good to see you, son." He muttered the word son, landing like an afterthought. Vanessa appeared at the top of the stairs in a green silk dress, hair perfectly curled, smile perfectly rehearsed. Adam followed a few steps behind his tie, just a little too tight, his face too pale for the season. She floated toward us like a hostess greeting donors at a charity gala. "Clara," she said, voice syrupy smooth. "Ethan, you look so grounded." Her hand lingered on my arm just long enough to feel like a claim. "Nice to see you too, Vanessa," I said. Ethan nodded politely beside me, his expression unreadable. She guided us toward the living room where guests in cocktail attire mingled with glasses of Pinot Noir. Adam was already shaking hands, charming, deflecting questions about his latest venture. He smiled, but his eyes were restless. "Vanessa's been dying to see you," he said, patting Ethan's shoulder. "She misses her little sister." The word little landed harder than he realized. Dinner was served around 7. The table gleamed under the chandelier. Crystal, silver linen napkins folded like origami. I remembered when the dining room had felt huge. Now it just felt staged. My mother hovered, making sure everyone's glass stayed full. My father started a toast about family, about sticking together through everything. I caught Vanessa's eyes flick toward Adam when he said that. Halfway through the main course, Vanessa leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. So she began her tone casual, but her smile sharp. "You're still working at the garage, right, Clara? Still tinkering away on those trucks?" She gave a small laugh. "You've always been so persistent. It's admirable." A few guests chuckled politely, unsure which way the wind was blowing. My father forced a smile. My mother's hand trembled as she poured more wine into her glass. Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. I set mine down slowly and met Vanessa's gaze. "Yes," I said evenly. "The garage is still running, and lately we've been busy. I let the pause hang just long enough. We're retrofitting National Fleet systems now." The table fell silent. The only sound was the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Someone cleared their throat. Vanessa blinked. National Fleet. She repeated her smile, faltering for the first time that evening. "Cascade Freight," Ethan said quietly, reaching for his water. "They were our first contract. It's been a good year." The tension was thick enough to chew. My father's eyes darted between us, trying to decide if we were joking. My mother froze with the wine bottle halfway tilted. Then Adam, desperate to fill the air, raised his glass. "Well," he said, forcing a grin, "cheers to those who know how to invest in the right places." I looked at him, my smile steady. "And to those who know how to fix what's broken, when it's time." A few guests tried to laugh. Most didn't. Vanessa's smile looked painted on, now her fingers gripping the stem of her glass too tightly. My mother sat down, setting the bottle down too fast. Red wine sloshed over the tablecloth, spreading like a stain no one dared clean. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch. For years they'd spoken for me over me around me, Tonight, one sentence was enough. Adam cleared his throat, turning to my father to start another topic. Property markets, anything, but his voice cracked slightly. Vanessa kept dabbing at the wine stain with her napkin, not meeting my eyes. Across the table, Ethan looked calm, even kind, but the set of his jaw said he'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had. Dinner stumbled forward after that, forced laughter, awkward clinking of cutlery stories that went nowhere. I could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing against my skin, the realization sinking in that the people they'd pitied had quietly outgrown them. No one said it out loud, but it hung there in the air like smoke. When dessert came, my mother asked if anyone wanted coffee. No one did. My father made a show of checking his watch. Adam excused himself to take a call that didn't exist. Vanessa followed him, her heels clicking across the tile, like punctuation marks in a story that was already ending. Ethan reached for my hand under the table. His palm was warm against mine. "You okay?" he murmured. I nodded, glancing toward the doorway where Vanessa had disappeared. "I didn't need to shout," I said softly. They heard me. The clock struck 8. Outside, the snow kept falling quiet and relentless, as if the world was washing itself clean. Inside, the room still smelled like candle wax and spilled wine and something else, something ending. The morning after Christmas was still and gray. The snow hadn't melted. It lay heavy over the yard, muffling every sound. I was in the garage early, checking one of the monitors for the Cascade Freight diagnostics, when I heard the crunch of tires on ice outside. A car door slammed, then another, then a third. The sound of multiple footsteps on the gravel. When I stepped outside, I saw them. My parents, Vanessa, Adam, and a man in a navy overcoat carrying a briefcase. Their expressions were tight and rehearsed, like people arriving for a meeting they didn't want to attend but needed to win. "Clara." My mother said, her voice brittle. "We didn't want to drop in like this, but it's urgent." Adam stepped forward, snowflakes melting in his hair. "We need to talk," he said. "Family to family." Behind him, the lawyer shifted uncomfortably, already regretting his presence here. I didn't answer. I just opened the garage door and gestured inside. The hydraulic arms lifted with a smooth hiss, revealing everything. The polished concrete floors, the clean chrome fixtures, the bright LED panels, reflecting off the logo mounted on the far wall. Helios drive systems. The machines hummed softly, monitors glowing with charts and data streams. My mother gasped quietly. My father looked around like he'd walked into another world. Vanessa hesitated near the doorway. One manicured hand gripping her purse strap too tight. Adam's confidence wavered for the first time. He cleared his throat. "Impressive," he said. "Really impressive. But that's why we're here." He laid a thick folder on the workbench. "We want to discuss a partnership, a family collaboration, you could say, combining resources too." I cut him off. "You mean taking control?" His jaw twitched. "I wouldn't put it like that. We're trying to help you scale Clara. This company could go global if we manage it properly. You don't have the infrastructure or the network." Ethan appeared beside me, wiping grease from his hands. His voice calm, but edged. "We seem to be managing fine." Adam smiled tightly. "You've done well, sure. But the market's volatile. You need investors who understand risk. I could bring that." My father stepped forward, eager to back him up. "He's right, sweetheart. Adam has experience. It's not about control. It's about family working together. Family." I repeated the word, tasting sour. Where was family when you laughed at our wedding? When you called us small? When Mom said I should take lessons from Vanessa on how to succeed? My mother flinched. "We were just trying to protect you," she whispered. "From what I asked. From being happy." Adam opened the folder and pushed it toward me. "There's a purchase agreement drafted. It gives you a substantial payout and keeps you on the board. All we're asking for is controlling interest." I glanced down. The number was high. Intentionally high, the kind that might have tempted someone else. Not me. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Clara, please. We're in trouble. You don't understand what's happening. If you don't help, everything collapses. Adam's fund." Adam shot her a sharp look. "Vanessa." But it was too late. Her tears were already spilling over. "He lost everything," she said. "The investors, the houses, the accounts. It's all gone. We just need one chance to fix it." My father's face reddened. "Clara, you owe this family. You wouldn't have made it this far without us." I felt Ethan's hand touch my back, grounding me. I took a deep breath and pointed toward the walls around us. You see this place? This is the same garage you all called worthless. The same one you laughed at. And now you're standing in it because you need it. Adam's expression hardened. You're being emotional. This isn't personal. I met his eyes. That's exactly what it is. The lawyer cleared his throat softly. Ms. Mitchell, if you'd just review the paperwork? Before he could finish, another voice came from behind him. Actually, I think I can save her the trouble. Marcus stepped into the doorway, his suit crisp against the cold air. He carried a single folder thinner, but far more dangerous. Good morning, he said, his tone polite but final. I represent Helios Drive Systems. Any proposals involving its assets must go through me. The lawyer blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me, who are you, corporate counsel? Marcus replied smoothly, placing his folder on top of Adam's. This company's assets, including the land and patents, are fully protected under Oregon corporate law. Ownership is limited to 2 individuals. Neither of them is you. Adam's face went pale. That can't be right. It is, Marcus said evenly. I filed the paperwork myself 2 years ago. You can check with the state registrar if you'd like. Silence stretched. My mother looked at my father, her lip trembling. Vanessa stood, frozen mascara streaking down her cheeks. Adam turned toward me, desperation cracking his voice. Clara, please. I'm asking you as family. I can't lose everything. I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't feel anger. Just clarity. You already did. His shoulders slumped. The lawyer started gathering his papers without another word. Vanessa sobbed quietly into her hands. My father stared at the floor. My mother's eyes darted toward me, pleading for something. Mercy, maybe. But I had none left to give. As they turned to leave, I said one last thing. You spent your lives teaching me how to feel small. I hope, just for a moment, you understand what that feels like. No one spoke. Their footsteps echoed on the concrete, fading into the cold morning. When the door closed, the garage was silent again, except for the hum of machinery. Ethan walked over, brushed his hand along my arm. You okay? I nodded slowly, my gaze drifting to the wall where the Helios logo gleamed under the lights. Yeah, I said. For the first time, I think I am. Outside their car, engines sputtered to life, tires crunching over the snow. Inside, the machines kept running. Steady, sure, unstoppable. They finally knew what it felt like to be dismissed. And I finally knew what it felt like to stand tall. The story broke 2 days later. I woke up to a dozen missed calls and a flood of notifications, all carrying the same headline. Adam Carter. Genius investor or fraud in a suit. Every major financial outlet had picked it up. The lead piece came from the Seattle Ledger, written by a reporter named Rachel Daniels. Her article was sharp and surgical. From dazzle to downfall. How Adam Carter's empire of illusion crumbled. It detailed everything. Phony reports, inflated assets, the misuse of investor funds. I stood in the kitchen, coffee cooling in my hands, as Ethan skimmed the article over my shoulder. The morning light caught the snow outside, making the whole world look too bright for a day like this. You think they'll go to jail? He asked. I shrugged. If there's any justice left in this world, maybe. The TV murmured in the background. Every station had the same footage. Adam leaving a downtown office surrounded by reporters shouting questions. Vanessa trailed behind him, face pale under sunglasses, her perfect composure cracked for the first time. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Mr. Carter, did you falsify your company's returns? Mrs. Carter, is it true you liquidated your assets before the collapse? Neither answered. They just kept walking. By the following afternoon, Vanessa's online empire vanished. Her videos, her glossy posts about financial freedom, her motivational captions, they were all deleted. Her name disappeared from every platform. My mother called it a temporary break from the spotlight, but we both knew it wasn't temporary. My parents refused interviews. They pulled the curtains shut and told the neighbors it was all a misunderstanding. But even behind closed doors, rumors seeped through. People talked about arrogance, about lies, about karma finally coming home. Andrea showed up the next day, bundled in a heavy coat, a bakery box balanced in her arms. She set it on the counter, opened it, and grinned. Karma's got GPS, huh? I laughed, shaking my head. Maybe it just took the scenic route. Ethan was out in the garage with a group of college kids from the local tech program, showing them how to recalibrate torque sensors. I could hear him explaining something in that calm, patient tone that made everyone feel smarter just for listening. "See?" he said, chuckling. "Machines don't care about ego. You fix them right, they run. You cut corners, they break. That's life." Andrea leaned against the doorway, watching him for a moment. "He's good with them," she said. "He's good with everyone," I replied. She turned back to me, eyes soft. "You know, if this were a movie, this is the part where the music swells and you drive away victorious." I smiled. Real life's quieter than that. The phone rang. My mother's number. For a second, I thought about letting it go to voicemail. Then I answered. "Clara," she said, voice trembling. "You've seen the news, I'm sure." "I have. Your father." She hesitated. "He understands now. About you. About Ethan. About everything. He didn't see it before. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing." Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine, Mom," I said softly. "I just hope you and Dad find some peace. That's all." There was a pause on the line, long and fragile. "You've always been stronger than we gave you credit for," she said finally. "I'm sorry it took so long to see that." When the call ended, I stood there in the kitchen for a while, the quiet pressing in from all sides. Ethan came in, his hands still smudged with grease. "Everything okay?" I nodded. "Yeah. For once, it actually is." We spent the evening in the garage, the same place that had once been dismissed as a greasy little workshop. Now it was spotless, organized, humming alive. The wall-mounted screen displayed a live feed of our latest fleet tests, all within target range. On another screen, a business channel played a segment titled Helios Drive, Systems Green Innovation Born in a Family Garage. The reporter's voice was steady, admiring. "What began as a small husband and wife operation in suburban Portland has become a national leader in hybrid retrofit technology. Their success story reminds us that real innovation rarely starts in boardrooms. It starts with people who refuse to give up." Ethan looked up at the screen and smiled. They finally got it right. I wiped my hands on a cloth, staring at the logo on the wall. Helios Drive Systems. The letters gleamed under the overhead lights, solid, permanent. Justice had arrived without a fight, without revenge, without noise. It came quietly, naturally, the way truth always does, when it's been patient long enough. I didn't need to say it out loud, but I thought it anyway. The sweetest kind of victory is the one that doesn't need to prove itself. A year later, Christmas morning arrived, quiet and white, the snow lying thick across the fields behind the Helios garage. The sign over the entrance glowed in soft blue light. Helios Drive Systems, its reflection stretching across the polished concrete. The company had changed so much in 12 months. We had a new office in Seattle, a small team of engineers and contracts stacked high enough to keep us busy for years. But the heart of it all still lived here in this old garage where everything began. Inside, the hum of machinery, mixed with the faint sound of holiday music playing from a radio someone forgot to turn off. A few of our younger technicians had come in early, eager to finish calibrations before heading home to their families. They moved around like sunlight, laughing, energized, proud to work in a place that felt alive. I sat on the front steps with a mug of coffee, watching snowflakes fall through the cold air. The metal steps were freezing beneath my hands, but the view was worth it. Frosted trees, the faint scent of oil and pine, and the steady pulse of a business that once existed only in dreams. I could still hear my father's voice from years ago telling me that grease and ambition didn't mix. He'd been wrong about that. The door creaked open behind me. Ethan stepped out, wiping his hands on a towel, his face warm despite the cold. The new interns finally figured out the torque calibration, he said, grinning. Didn't even blow a fuse this time. "Progress," I said, smiling back. He walked over and sat beside me, shoulders brushing mine. In his hand was a small, cream-colored envelope, edges crinkled. "This came for you," he said. "Your mom's handwriting." I took it carefully, the paper soft from handling. Inside was a letter, written in her delicate cursive. "Clara, we're proud of you. I'm sorry it took us this long to understand what we should have seen all along. You built something beautiful. Your father reads every article, even if he won't admit it. I hope one day you'll forgive us for not believing in you sooner. Love, Mom." The words didn't sting. They didn't heal anything either. They just existed, like a soft snowfall covering the rough edges of what used to hurt. I folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it beside me. Ethan nudged my shoulder. "You okay?" I nodded. "Yeah. I don't need an apology. I just needed them to see me. He smiled that quiet, steady smile that had carried me through every failure and every triumph. Well, they see you now. Probably see me too. He stood, stretching his back. You know, they used to call me the poor mechanic. I laughed. They did. He looked down at me, mock serious. Now they can't afford to hire me. We both laughed, the sound echoing against the garage walls. The snow outside seemed to glow brighter for it. Inside, one of the interns turned up the radio, and the old speaker hummed out a Christmas song slightly off-key but cheerful all the same. For a while we didn't talk. We just sat there, two people who'd built something out of nothing, surrounded by everything we'd earned. The past didn't weigh on me anymore. It simply existed like an old machine tucked in a corner, still there, but no longer running. I stood brushing snow from my coat. The Helios sign above us caught the morning light reflecting off the polished letters. It looked different now, bolder, permanent, like it had always belonged here. I turned to Ethan, smiling. You know what the best part is? What they used to think success looked like suits and champagne. I nodded toward the garage where our team worked, laughing, sleeves rolled up. Turns out it looks a lot like this. He grinned, slipping his arm around my shoulders. I'll drink to that. With coffee, of course. The wind carried the scent of snow and steel as I looked toward the horizon where the world stretched wide and clean. The years of being underestimated, mocked, dismissed. They'd all led here. Not to revenge, not to bitterness, but to something far better, peace. The lights from inside cast a warm glow on the icy ground. I turned back one last time, watching them flicker against the silver metal. And now, I said softly, meeting Ethan's eyes, guess who the real genius is? He laughed, shaking his head, and kissed my forehead. You always were. For a long moment, everything was still. The hum of the machines, the falling snow. The quiet kind of joy that doesn't need an audience. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told you'd never make it, remember this. Sometimes silence is the most powerful answer there is. Stay patient. Let your work speak. The right people will hear it. And when they do, you won't have to say a word.